Welcome to Anime with Annie. In this video today, I'll be talking about everything we know about one of the most admired manga out there called Death Note. But before we get into it, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to never miss any updates from us. That said, let's begin. Death Note is a psychological thriller written by Sukumi Ohaba, with illustrations by Takashi Obata. The story's basic concept is that Raikou, a Shinigami from another dimension, decides to visit the Earth realm and drop a death note there to see what happens, purely for pleasure. Light Yagami, the protagonist, discovers the death note at school and starts reading its instructions. The Shinigami use the death note as a tool to end human life and prolong their own. A human is given the capacity to write another human's name in the death note and kill when they touch them. In addition, they can view the Shinigami with who own it. Light Yagami is introduced to Ryuk, who explains that his role is to watch over him and that Light is free to use the death note however he sees fit, even throwing it away if he so chooses. Light, a detective's son, has been working hard at school just to fulfill his father's dream of enforcing justice. As a result of the death note's newly discovered power, Light started using it exclusively to kill criminals, which causes his morality to deteriorate. The plans for justice, however, are threatened by investigation later in the series, when an independent task force headed by a mastermind known only as L starts to notice the patterns in these criminal deaths. The killer is now referred to as Kira by both the general public and the detectives. Death Note appears to be a fantasy series at first glance. However, despite the presence of Shinigami, this tale has a stronger sense of realism, since it considers the nature of justice and whether evil offenders deserve to perish. We start to notice a huge change in Light's character and morality as the series progresses, and Light, Kira, and L continue to outwit one another. As the series progresses, more and more new characters are added, some of my favorites being Misa Name, who changes the course of the plot. When another Shinigami arrives at Earth carrying yet another death note, Misa's first seen. She is presented in a way that I won't reveal here, but it marks a significant turning point in the conflict between Light and L's minds. The chess-like contest of wits between Light Yagami and L is one of the few aspects of Death Note that makes it so captivating, who goes by a few names. This psychological conflict is comparable to that between Sherlock Holmes and his foe Moriarty. Even when you think one of the characters is in a position of power, the other character finds a way to fool the reader by thinking 10 steps ahead about how to outsmart them. You might be wondering, why doesn't Light just use the Death Note to kill L then, if you haven't read the series? But the constraints of the Death Note place limitations on how Light can behave, which adds to the story's beauty. For instance, Light needs to be aware of the genuine names and physical descriptions of his victims. Fortunately for L, he keeps his real name secret. In the Death Note series, there comes a pivotal moment after which the plot and tone sharply shift. Some claim this is where the plot loses steam. Personally, I wouldn't say it drops off. But following this pivotal moment, it obviously loses some of its sharpness. The nice thing about the Death Note is that it makes you consider your own morality. Because Light Yagami, the story's protagonist, or is he, is essentially the villain. But many people like me are hoping that Light will always prevail in the many mental conflicts. But the desire to see Light triumph could equally be motivated by a desire for the narrative to continue. When it does arrive, the end comes with a shockwave of circumstances. That's all I can say without giving anything away. But the way the narrative finishes feels less believable than some of the early parts of the story. I became so engrossed in the Death Note manga that I frequently stayed up long past my bedtime to read the entire series. It was energizing to read something so grim and morally ambiguous, and it's the most hooked I've been on a series in a long time. Since finishing Death Note, I've read a ton of manga in an effort to discover more of the same. But because it's such a singular tale, it will take you a while to find something that gives you the same feeling as reading Death Note for the first time. Most of Death Note is exhilarating to read, and has excellent writing. The first 34 to 36 chapters or so are all excellent. They are the best manga I've ever read. The quality does then decline during the Yotsuba section for a good number of chapters, with comedy and pointless chatter detracting from the seriousness and slowing down the story. But the story immediately returns to being epic, and then reaches its peak, with the first half of the story's tear-inducing conclusion. Once the second half of the story starts, it starts off intriguing, but gradually loses quality and flow, with way too much unnecessary conversation taking up space. The plot then resumes being exciting about chapter 80, and this time it doesn't stop until the very end. The author seems to recapture the magic that made the first portion of the story so spectacular, after a protracted period of dull chapters. In my opinion, what makes Death Note unique is how brilliantly the author describes our environment. Like our reality, The Death Note universe is dark, dismal, and full of individuals who don't deserve to live. As I read, I couldn't help but consider what might happen if a Death Note appeared in our society. Would people still believe that killing is bad, or would Kira gain more and more respect as the world changed as more criminals perished and crime fell dramatically? Although we will never know the answer to this question, it makes for some fairly interesting reading for readers of a Shonen Jump title. The two most attention-grabbing remarks the author has made in interviews are that he or she allegedly only had up to chapter 3 planned when he or she started, and that he or she didn't mean to communicate a message through the novel. It's amazing how someone could craft such a sophisticated tale with such little forethought, generating so many in-depth discussions about subjects like good and evil, when the author's only intention was to make an amusing tale. I've always believed that Death Note gives forth a clear message. No matter how perfect the person who tries, it is not possible for a human to enter the realm of God. I'll use myself as an example of someone who reads further into Death Note than the author meant. Anyway, since this review has already gotten much longer than I anticipated, I'll try to wrap it up when I address the anime. The anime, in my opinion, is the best manga adaptation ever created. It's pretty much perfect. With the ideal color selection, fantastic camera angles, little tweaks that made some scenes much more dramatic, like a certain wicked grin in episode 25, and a much better second half of the plot, Madhouse, the anime studio, significantly improved the experience. When they eliminated all the tedious chit-chat from the second half of the story, Madhouse accomplished the best thing they could have done. They transformed what was slow-paced and monotonous into something fast-paced and fascinating. The only mistake they made was slightly modifying the conclusion. I also have to say that Death Note features the best Japanese voice acting I've ever heard, and the best soundtrack I've ever heard. In conclusion, Death Note is a masterpiece that everyone should read or watch. If you prefer reviews to conclude with a score, I would give this one an 8 out of 10. It seems reasonable to give the anime a little higher grade than the, in my opinion, superior manga. Even though I would like to go into further detail, the review has already dragged on longer than I had anticipated. And that concludes my review of Death Note manga. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to like and subscribe to my channel, Anime with Annie, for more such exciting anime content and reviews. And please leave comments about what you thought of today's video. And remember, have an Anime